Keisha was only 18 years old, but her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had lived a lifetime of disappointment. In a neighborhood where hope was as rare as a sunrise without smog, she had grown up fighting battles she never chose. Her childhood was a collection of broken promises, her father disappearing before she could form a memory of his face, her mother slipping deeper into addiction until the state stepped in and tore Keisha away. She became another child lost in the foster care system, shuffled from one home to another like an unwanted package nobody knew what to do with. By the time she turned 16, Keisha had stopped believing in second chances. She aged out of foster care with nothing but a trash bag full of clothes and a thin folder of caseworker notes that read more like a list of failures than a record of her life. School had never been her safe place. Bullies mocked her worn shoes, teachers pitted her, and she quietly dropped out after her junior year. With no diploma, no family, and no safety net, she had to survive the only way she knew, by using the one thing men had always taken from her, her body. Yet, even in those moments when the world seemed to crush her spirit, Keisha clung to scraps of hope. She kept a worn photograph tucked deep in her purse, a picture of herself at 10 years old, standing in front of a foster home with her hair in pigtails. She had drawn a big smile on that photo with a purple marker, as if trying to convince her younger self that happiness was possible. Whenever nights on the street felt too cold, whenever her body felt like nothing more than a commodity, she would pull out that picture and whisper, "Hold on, girl. Someday, you'll be safe." Keisha dreamed in small ways, the kind people rarely noticed. She wanted a little apartment with a front door that locked properly, a fridge that stayed full, maybe even a cat that would curl up at her feet at night. Sometimes she'd pass a young mother pushing a stroller down the block and wonder what it would be like to raise a child with love, to give them the stability she never had. These weren't grand dreams of fame or fortune. They were quiet dreams, the kind that told the world she still believed, in some corner of her heart, that life could be gentler than what she had known. But every dream came with the ache of doubt. She feared she would never escape. Each night felt like a gamble, each stranger's car like a coin toss between survival and disaster. Still, that photograph, those small dreams, kept her moving. They gave her enough courage to say yes when her phone buzzed with another number she didn't recognize. Enough courage to believe that maybe tomorrow she would finally get her break. Little did she know, the break she imagined would never come. Instead, the call she answered that night would carry her into the arms of a man who saw her not as a person with dreams, but as a disposable object. The streets at night became her stage, though there was nothing glamorous about it. Neon signs buzzed overhead while car headlights swept across her young face, catching the traces of innocence that still clung to her. She wore makeup to look older, to seem tougher, but the truth was clear to anyone who looked closely. Keisha was just a girl pretending she knew how to be a woman. One evening, sitting on the curb with another girl from her block, she let her guard slip. "Do you ever think we'll get out of this?" Keisha asked quietly, hugging her knees. Her friend, a 21-year-old who had been in the game longer, exhaled smoke into the humid air. "Out. Honey, this is it. The sooner you accept it, the less it hurts." Keisha didn't answer. She stared down at the cracks in the pavement, wishing she could fall through them into some other life. It would be easy for outsiders to judge her. Some did. They saw only the short skirts, the wandering eyes, the hurried steps into strangers' cars. But the truth was more complicated and more tragic. Keisha didn't dream of wealth or fame. She only wanted stability, a bed that was hers, a refrigerator that wasn't empty, someone who would remember her birthday. Yet, in a world that ignored girls like her, survival came with a price. Every night she worked, she promised herself it would be the last. Every night, she prayed for a miracle. But miracles don't come often to neighborhoods like hers. On the night that would seal her fate, the city felt restless. Sirens wailed in the distance, and the streets hummed with the tension of summer heat. Keisha adjusted her thin jacket and tried to quiet the unease in her stomach. Something about the air felt heavy, as if warning her that trouble was close. But she couldn't afford to ignore a client, not when rent was overdue and her phone bill threatened to cut her off from the only people she still called friends. When her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize, she hesitated only for a moment. Money was money. She answered. The man's voice on the other end was low, confident, and cold. He didn't ask questions. He gave directions. As she walked toward the meeting spot, Keisha thought of her younger self, the little girl who used to draw pictures of a house with a garden, the kind of home she had never known. That girl seemed so far away now. What would she think if she saw the woman Keisha had become? Would she cry, or would she understand? She paused beneath a flickering streetlight, pulled out a cracked compact mirror, and reapplied her lipstick. Her hands trembled slightly, though she told herself it was just the night chill. She wanted to look strong, untouchable, because strength was often the only shield she had. Then, headlights cut through the darkness, and an old car rolled to a stop. The window slid down. The man inside leaned forward, his face hidden in shadow. "You Keisha?" he asked. His voice was the same one she had heard on the phone, steady, commanding. She nodded. "Get in." For a second, she thought about walking away. Something in his tone carried danger, like a snake coiled and ready to strike. But survival had taught her to silence her instincts. Men wanted confidence, not hesitation. So she opened the door, climbed inside, and closed it behind her. As the car pulled away, Keisha glanced at the stranger behind the wheel. His grip on the steering wheel was tight, his jaw clenched, his eyes sharp and unfeeling. She didn't know his name, and she didn't ask. In her world, questions could be dangerous. All she knew was that tonight, she was once again gambling with her life, and she had no idea she was about to lose everything. If Keisha's life had been shaped by abandonment, Marcus Lane's was shaped by violence. Born in the same city, but raised in a far darker corner of it, Marcus grew up believing that power was the only language anyone respected. His father was a ghost, never around, except in the whispers of family members who said he'd been locked away for armed robbery. His mother worked double shifts, but spent what little she made on boyfriends who treated Marcus like a nuisance. By the age of 12, he had already stopped coming home most nights, choosing instead to run with older boys who introduced him to a different kind of education: how to steal, how to fight, and how to never let anyone see weakness. By 15, Marcus had a rap sheet longer than some men twice his age. Shoplifting, assault, carjacking. His crimes escalated as quickly as his reputation. In the neighborhoods where street loyalty meant survival, Marcus earned both fear and admiration. Some said he had the eyes of a predator, always scanning, always waiting for a moment to strike. Others said he was destined for prison or an early grave. Either way, Marcus didn't care. In his mind, the world was divided into two kinds of people: those who took and those who got taken. He had already chosen his side. Prison came early, a rite of passage he wore like a badge. At 19, after a failed armed robbery, he was sentenced to 6 years. Inside, he didn't shrink, he thrived. He learned the rhythms of control, how to intimidate with silence, how to command respect with violence. He walked out of prison not reformed, but hardened, sharper, colder, more dangerous than before. Back on the streets, Marcus built himself a name. He wasn't just a thief now. He was a man who inspired fear. The kind of man people crossed the street to avoid. He liked it that way. Respect, he thought, came not from kindness, but from domination. Women, to him, were disposable, objects of desire or tools for pleasure, never people worth trust or compassion. One night, in a dimly lit bar, Marcus leaned back in his chair while his crew argued over a botched job. He silenced them with a glare. "You all worry too much," he muttered, taking a drag from his cigarette. "Life's simple. You take what you want. If they can't stop you, it's yours." One of his younger guys shook his head nervously. "Marcus, you push too far, man. One day the law's gonna catch you." Marcus smirked, exhaling smoke through his nose. "Catch me? They've been trying for years. I don't get caught. I do the catching." That arrogance fueled every choice he made. He sought out risk, not because he needed the thrill, but because he needed to prove he was untouchable. Whether it was a convenience store clerk who hesitated handing over cash or a rival hustler who dared to disrespect him, Marcus always responded the same way, with force. But beneath his bravado, there was something darker still. Marcus wasn't just violent, he was cruel. He didn't just want to win, he wanted others to suffer. He took satisfaction in watching fear bloom in someone's eyes, in hearing the crack of bones, in knowing that he had broken another human being down to nothing. To Marcus, that was the truest form of power. So when he decided to call for a girl that night, it wasn't because he was lonely. It wasn't even about sex. It was about control, about proving, once again, that he could take what he wanted and leave nothing behind. Sitting in his car under the dim light of a broken street lamp, Marcus tapped the steering wheel with restless fingers. He had the number from a contact who knew where to find young girls desperate enough to answer a stranger's call. When Keisha's soft voice came through the line, cautious yet compliant, a twisted smile curved his lips. "She'll do," he muttered to himself. His crew had warned him more than once that he was tempting fate, that one day his violence would come back to swallow him whole. But Marcus didn't believe in fate. He believed in dominance. He believed in the raw, unshakable truth that fear was stronger than love, and that cruelty was stronger than mercy. That night, as he waited for Keisha to step into his car, Marcus wasn't thinking about consequences. He wasn't thinking about the girl's age, her broken past, or the fact that she was somebody's child. To him, she was already reduced to nothing more than an object, another fleeting chance to satisfy his hunger for power. And when she opened the passenger door and slid into the seat beside him, Marcus Lane's fate, and hers, was sealed. The night was heavy with humidity, the kind that clung to your skin and made the air feel suffocating. Streetlights flickered like dying candles, casting broken halos of light on the cracked pavement. Keisha stood beneath one of them, her thin jacket pulled tight against the damp summer air. She adjusted her lipstick in a compact mirror, her hand trembling though she tried to steady it. The car rolled to a stop in front of her, and she recognized the voice from the phone call when the window slid down. "You Keisha?" the man asked. She nodded, forcing a professional calm into her voice. "Yeah, that's me. Get in." There was no smile, no charm, just the blunt authority of a man used to being obeyed. For a split second, instinct screamed at her to walk away. But survival had taught her that hesitation was dangerous and money was scarce. So she climbed inside, shutting the door softly behind her. The smell of the car hit her immediately. Cheap cologne mixed with cigarette smoke and something metallic, almost like blood. The man's face was shadowed, but his grip on the steering wheel told her everything. His knuckles were tight, pale against his dark skin. His jaw was set, his eyes sharp, unblinking. Marcus didn't speak as he pulled away, the silence wrapping around them like a noose. Keisha shifted uncomfortably, staring out the window, trying to pretend this was just another job, just another night. But there was something in the air, something different. Finally, he spoke. 18, huh? Fresh. I like that. She kept her voice steady. "Just tell me what you want, and we'll get it over with." He chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "You think this is about what I want?" He glanced at her, his eyes gleaming. "This is about what I take." Her stomach tightened, but she forced herself not to react. She had dealt with cruel men before, men who liked to remind her of how powerless she was. Still, something about this man's tone sent a chill crawling down her spine. The car wound through narrow back streets until he pulled into a deserted lot, the kind of place where shadows swallowed everything. He killed the engine and turned toward her. "You nervous?" he asked, his voice almost mocking. Keisha straightened her back, lifting her chin. "No, just don't waste my time." For a moment, he studied her face as though weighing her defiance. Then he smiled, not warmly, but with the slow curl of a predator who had found his prey. The exchange that followed was mechanical, detached. Keisha went through the motions, her mind drifting somewhere else. She thought about her childhood drawings of gardens and houses, about the life she used to dream of. If she could just make it through tonight, maybe she'd save enough to escape this city. Maybe she'd finally have a chance to start over. But Marcus had no intention of letting her leave. When it was over, she adjusted her clothes quickly, ready to collect her pay and walk away. She reached for her small purse on the seat beside her. That was when she felt his hand clamp around her wrist, iron strong. "Were you going so fast?" he asked. She froze, forcing calm into her voice. "I did my job. Now it's time for you to pay, and I'll be gone." Marcus leaned in close, his breath hot against her cheek. "Pay? You think I owe you something?" Her pulse hammered in her throat. That was the deal. He laughed, a hollow sound that filled the car. "No, sweetheart. The deal is whatever I say it is." She tried to pull her hand free, but his grip tightened, fingers digging into her skin. Panic flared in her chest. She had seen danger before, but this was different. This was final. "Let me go," she whispered, her voice breaking despite her effort to stay strong. Instead, He reached up and wrapped his hand around her throat. The world tilted, and suddenly she was gasping, clawing at his fingers. His eyes never blinked, never softened. To him, this wasn't rage, it was pleasure. Her legs kicked against the floorboard. Her fingernails scraped his arm, but his hold only grew stronger. "Shoo," he muttered, almost tenderly. "It'll be over soon." Keisha's vision blurred, her mind racing through fragments of memory. The foster homes, the birthday she spent alone, the little girl she used to be drawing houses in crayon. She thought of escape, of the life she would never live. And then there was nothing. When Marcus finally released her, her body slumped lifeless against the seat. He stared at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with a calm satisfaction. To him, she was no longer a girl. She was a discarded object, a secret that needed to vanish. He dragged her out of the car, her heels scraping against the pavement, and left her in a dark alley nearby. He didn't look back as he walked away. The night swallowed her body, silent and cold. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. And in that moment, the story of Keisha, the abandoned girl at 18, came to a brutal, senseless end. But Marcus Lane's story was only beginning. The alley was silent except for the faint drip of water from a rusted pipe and the shuffle of rats searching for scraps. In the darkness, Keisha's body lay crumpled against the wall, her face tilted toward the sky she would never see again. The neon light from a nearby liquor store flickered faintly over her still figure, casting her in a cruel, stuttering glow. It was past midnight when a man named Luther, a homeless veteran who slept in the alleys, stumbled across her. He had learned to ignore many things in the city, shouting matches, broken glass, even the occasional gunshot. But something about the shape on the ground made him stop. He stepped closer, his worn boots crunching on broken bottles. "Miss," he called out softly, his voice cracking from years of cigarettes and cold nights. "You okay?" There was no answer. As he crouched down, the light caught her open eyes, frozen wide with terror. Luther staggered back, his stomach twisting. "Oh Lord, oh my Lord," he whispered. His hands trembled as he fumbled for the old flip phone he carried, one of the few possessions he still had. He dialed 911 with shaking fingers. By the time the police arrived, the alley had drawn a small crowd. Residents leaned out of windows, whispering, while others gathered at the yellow tape the officers strung across the entrance. The air was thick with curiosity and dread, the kind that makes people stare even when they know they shouldn't. Detective Raymond Harris, a man in his 50s with weary eyes and a trench coat that had seen too many crime scenes, stepped into the alley. He paused when he saw her. Years on the job had hardened him, but the sight of a young girl left discarded like trash always pierced through the armor. 18 at most, he muttered, shaking his head. "God help us." His partner, a younger detective named Morales, knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb the evidence. "She's been gone a few hours. Strangulation, by the looks of it." Harris clenched his jaw. He'd seen the marks on her neck before. The bruises, the imprint of fingers that treated life like it was something to crush for sport. "Another girl," he said bitterly. "Another one the world forgot." The forensic team worked quietly, photographing every angle, dusting for prints, placing markers near a cigarette butt and a set of tire tracks that hadn't yet been washed away by the night's drizzle. Each click of the camera echoed in the alley like a metronome of tragedy. Luther, the man who found her, stood nearby, wrapped in a police blanket. His voice was shaky when Harris questioned him. "I didn't touch her, sir. I swear. I was just walking by, and there she was, looking at me with those eyes. Lord, I ain't seen nothing like it since the war." His words trailed off into silence, haunted by memories he didn't explain. Harris placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing calling us. Nobody's blaming you." But even as he said it, Harris knew the city wouldn't care much about who Keisha had been. To most, she'd just be another Jane Doe, another statistic in the rising tide of violence. And that was what cut the deepest. Because to Harris, she was clearly more. She was a child, robbed of every chance she might have had. By dawn, news vans had already parked near the alley, their bright lights turning tragedy into spectacle. Reporters spoke into cameras, their voices urgent. Authorities discovered the body of a young woman, believed to be no older than 18, in a back alley on the city's south side. In the background, residents shook their heads. Some muttered prayers. Others whispered cruel judgments. Probably one of those girls working the street. Detective Harris overheard and felt anger flare inside him. He wanted to shout at them, to tell them she had a name, that she had once been a child who probably dreamed of birthdays and Christmas mornings just like their own kids. But he held his tongue. His job was not to argue. It was to find the monster who had done this. Before the sun fully rose, Keisha's body was lifted into a black bag and wheeled into the coroner's van. For a brief moment, the alley was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But the silence was heavier now, filled with grief, with anger, with the unspoken promise of justice. As Harris watched the van doors close, he whispered under his breath, "I'll find him, kid. Whoever he is, wherever he's hiding, I'll bring him down. You didn't deserve this." And in that vow, a new chapter of the story began, not for Keisha, whose life had ended, but for the man who had taken it. Marcus Lane had left his mark on the city that night. Now, the city was about to turn and hunt him back. By morning, the story of the girl in the alley was everywhere. Headlines screamed across local papers. 18-year-old found dead in Southside Alley. The evening news led with grainy footage of detectives crouching under yellow tape. Radio hosts debated what it meant for the city, for its safety, for its children. And though Keisha's name wasn't yet public, her story was already sparking fire. In church basements and barber shops, in corner diners, and on buses rattling through the city, people argued about her. Some voices cracked with sorrow. Others dripped with judgment. At a small cafe downtown, an older woman stirred sugar into her coffee while shaking her head. "That poor child," she said softly. "She was just a baby. 18 is no age to leave this world." Across from her, a man snorted dismissively. "Baby? She was out there selling herself. You think good girls end up dead in alleys? She chose that life." The woman's eyes narrowed, her hand tightening on the mug. "Nobody chooses to die like that. Nobody chooses to be thrown away like garbage. Maybe you ought to think about what pushed her there." The man leaned back, defensive. "I work 2 jobs. Ain't nobody giving me handouts. If she wanted a better life, she should have done the same. Don't tell me the streets made her do it." Their argument reflected the larger battle raging across the city. On one side, people mourned her as a victim of a cruel system, poverty, foster care, exploitation. On the other, she was dismissed as another casualty of her own bad choices. The truth, Detective Harris knew, was more complicated than either side wanted to admit. That afternoon, Harris attended a community meeting called by local activists. The small gymnasium was packed, the air buzzing with grief and fury. A young pastor stood at the front, his voice trembling with emotion as he addressed the crowd. "This girl's death is not just her tragedy, it's ours. She was 18 years old, abandoned by the system, ignored by her neighbors, and preyed upon by men who saw her as disposable. We can't stand here and point fingers at her. We must point them at ourselves. What kind of city lets its children die in alleys?" Applause thundered through the room, but not everyone agreed. A man in the back shouted, "She was a prostitute. Why should we march for her when there are good kids being shot every week?" The room erupted into noise, shouts of anger, cries of support. Harris, standing against the wall, watched the storm unfold. He had seen it all before. Society loved to debate who deserved compassion and who didn't. But to him, the argument was irrelevant. A girl was dead. That was all that mattered. Later, back at the precinct, Harris sat with Morales, sifting through reports. Morales rubbed his temples. "You hear what they're saying out there? Half the city wants justice, the other half acts like she deserved it." Harris sighed, staring at the crime scene photo on his desk. "Doesn't matter what they think. Our job is the same. We find the man who did this." Still, the controversy weighed on him. He had a daughter once, only a few years older than Keisha. He couldn't help but imagine her face superimposed on the lifeless body in that alley. He wondered how people would talk about her if fate had been crueler. Would they dismiss her too? Would they decide she wasn't worth saving? Meanwhile, the media circus grew louder. A local talk show invited callers to weigh in. First caller, "I don't care what she was doing out there. She was somebody's child. She deserves justice." Second caller, "We can't keep excusing bad behavior. If you play with fire, you get burned." Tragic, but that's the truth. The host leaned into the controversy, fueling both sides. Ratings, after all, fed on outrage. But beneath the noise, something else was happening. Keisha's story began to resonate with those who had lived similar lives. Girls still walking the streets, women who had escaped, families who had lost children. They gathered candles and pictures, creating a memorial at the mouth of the alley. Flowers piled up, wilted by the summer heat, but replaced each day by strangers who whispered prayers under their breath. One night, Harris walked past and paused. A little girl, no older than 10, stood with her mother, placing a teddy bear on the ground. She looked up and asked, "Mom, why did she die?" Her mother's voice wavered. "Because someone hurt her, baby. Someone who didn't see her as a person." The girl frowned. "That's not fair." "No," her mother whispered. "It's not." Harris turned away, his throat tight. In that child's simple words, he heard the truth stripped of politics, of judgment, of excuses. It wasn't fair. It would never be fair. The controversy would rage on, whether she was a victim or a sinner, whether she deserved pity or blame. But in the end, none of that changed the fact that she was gone, and a killer was still out there, walking free. Harris lit a cigarette outside the precinct that night, staring at the city skyline. The smoke curled upward, vanishing into the dark. "You'll get your justice, kid," he murmured. "I don't care what they say. I don't care if the world forgets you. I won't." And with that vow, the hunt for Marcus Lane began in earnest. Detective Harris had seen too many murders vanish into the cold case files of the city, lives forgotten because no one cared enough to fight for them. But this case was different. He couldn't shake Keisha's face, her wide-open eyes staring at nothing, her youth stolen. He carried her photograph in his folder like a silent reminder. This girl would not be just another statistic. The precinct buzzed with activity as the investigation into her death deepened. Forensics confirmed what Harris already knew. She had been strangled. DNA was collected from beneath her fingernails, evidence that told them she had fought hard in those final moments. Tire tracks in the alley matched an older model sedan, dark in color, possibly a Chevy. Every camera, every corner store, every gas station within 10 blocks, Harris ordered. "I want eyes on that car." Morales clicked through hours of surveillance footage. His eyes were bloodshot when he finally called Harris over. "Got him. Look here." On the screen, a grainy video showed a vehicle pulling out of the alley at 2:13 a.m. The driver's face was partly visible as the light from a street lamp caught it for only a second. But that second was enough. "Marcus Lane," Harris muttered, recognition flashing across his face. He had crossed paths with Lane's name before: armed robberies, assaults, a rap sheet that looked like a resume for violence. But Lane had always been slippery, always just beyond their grasp. Now, Harris thought grimly, the man had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. They built their case quickly. Witnesses placed Lane near the alley that night. An informant confirmed he had been asking around for young girls days before. His fingerprints turned up on a cigarette but left at the scene. The evidence stacked higher with each passing day, painting a picture too clear to deny. But catching Marcus Lane would not be simple. He knew the streets better than most, and he trusted no one. By the time warrants were issued, he was already moving, switching locations, hiding in abandoned houses, keeping one step ahead of the law. Lane wasn't just running. He was taunting. Word reached the precinct that he had been spotted at a corner store, smirking at the security camera before vanishing again. In another neighborhood, he left a half-empty bottle of liquor on a stoop where one of Harris's informants lived, as if to say, "I know you're talking. I know you can't catch me." For Harris, the chase became personal. Each false lead felt like an insult. Each narrow escape a reminder that Marcus was playing his own twisted game of cat and mouse. The detectives tracked him to a flop house one rainy night, sirens silent as they crept through the door with their guns drawn. The place reeked of mold and stale smoke. A mattress lay in the corner, still warm, a cigarette burning out in the ashtray. Lane had been there, minutes earlier. "Damn it," Morales muttered, slamming a fist against the wall. Harris stared at the glowing ember in the ashtray, his jaw tight. "He's watching us," he said. "He wants us to feel like he's untouchable." The pattern repeated for days. An abandoned car with Lane's fingerprints left on the wheel. A street camera catching the back of his head as he disappeared into a subway tunnel. Always close enough to prove he'd been there, but never close enough to catch. It was as if he was daring them, forcing the city to remember his name every time he slipped away. And yet, each escape only fueled Harris more. He refused to let Keisha become another ghost lost in paperwork. Standing over a city map dotted with pins and red string, Harris told Morales late one night, "We're not chasing him anymore. We're hurting him, and sooner or later, he'll run out of places to hide." Harris and Morales spent long nights driving through the city's underbelly, following whispers and rumors. At one rundown bar, a bartender leaned close and said, "Lane was here last night. He looked spooked, asked for a bottle, and left fast." At another stop, a small-time hustler swore, "Man, Marcus ain't gonna let y'all take him. He'd rather go out blasting." Each lead carried danger, but Harris pressed forward. The city felt tense, like it was holding its breath, waiting for the moment predator and pursuer would finally collide. One humid evening, the break came. An informant tipped them off. Marcus was holed up in a derelict house on the edge of town, a place where addicts and drifters squatted. The SWAT team was called in. Officers lined the street in silence, their weapons drawn, hearts pounding. Harris stood at the front, his jaw tight. "This is it," he told Morales. "No more girls. No more alleys." The order was given, and the team moved in. Boots thundered against the wooden porch, the door crashed open, and the house exploded with shouts of "Police!" Down on the ground. For a moment, there was chaos, glass breaking, footsteps scrambling, a body darting through a back hallway. Marcus tried to run, shoving through a side door, but an officer tackled him hard into the dirt. He thrashed like a trapped animal, cursing, spitting, fighting with everything he had. Harris stepped forward, breathing heavy, and locked eyes with him as the cuffs snapped shut. For the first time, he saw Marcus not as a legend of the streets, not as the untouchable predator, but as a man undone, powerless, caught. "You're done, Lane," Harris said coldly. "It's over." Marcus sneered, blood on his lip from the scuffle. "You think this changes anything? Girls like her, they'll keep dying. I'm not the only one out here." Harris's hands tightened into fists, but he forced himself to stay steady. "Maybe you're right, but you won't kill another." As Marcus was hauled to his feet and shoved into the back of a squad car, residents of the neighborhood began to gather, drawn by the flashing red and blue lights. Some shouted curses at him. Others just watched silently, their faces unreadable. For Harris, the scene felt like both an ending and a beginning. Keisha was gone. Nothing could bring her back. But tonight, the man who had stolen her future was no longer free. And for Harris, that was a small measure of justice, one he intended to see carried all the way to its final conclusion. The trial of Marcus Lane began 6 months after his arrest, and by then the city was hungry for justice. News cameras lined the courthouse steps, their lenses fixed on the man who had haunted headlines for months. Some reporters called him the Alley Killer, others simply Lane, as though his name alone was enough to conjure fear. People whispered about him in grocery stores and church pews, shaking their heads at how one man could embody so much cruelty. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric, half mourning, half fury. Families of other victims of violence sat shoulder to shoulder with strangers who had never known Keisha but had been moved by her story. At the front, the prosecution table was stacked with files, photographs, and a quiet determination. Across the aisle, Lane sat with his defense attorney, a slick man in a sharp suit who looked more nervous than his client. Marcus wore the same expression he had shown the night he was caught, defiant, almost amused. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, as if this were nothing more than another game he could win. But behind him, 2 deputies stood firm, their presence a reminder that his days of walking free were over. The judge, a gray-haired woman known for her no-nonsense style, struck her gavel. Court is now in session. The people versus Marcus Lane. The prosecutor, a woman named Deborah Carter, rose first. Her voice carried the weight of righteous anger. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not complicated. 18-year-old Keisha Williams was alive on the night of July 14th. Hours later, she was found strangled to death in a filthy alley. Evidence will show that the defendant, Marcus Lane, lured her into his car, exploited her, and murdered her with his bare hands. He treated her as if she were disposable. But she was not disposable. She was a daughter, a human being, a life with value. And today, you will hold him accountable." Her words stirred the courtroom, and some jurors shifted uncomfortably under the intensity of her gaze. The defense rose next. The attorney smoothed his tie and tried to sound steady. What happened that night was tragic, yes. But my client did not intend to kill this young woman. This was not premeditated murder. It was an unfortunate accident, the result of passion and poor choices. We will show that while Mr. Lane is no saint, he is not guilty of murder in the first degree. Marcus smirked at those words, as though amused at the attempt to soften his cruelty. Over the next days, the prosecution painted a devastating picture. Witnesses testified about seeing Marcus in the area. The forensic expert described the marks on Keisha's neck, the bruises that showed deliberate, forceful strangulation. A fingerprint analyst held up the cigarette, but from the alley with Marcus's prints clearly lifted from it. The medical examiner confirmed that Keisha had struggled, fighting for her life until the very end. Detective Harris took the stand, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I've seen a lot of crime scenes in my 30 years, he told the jury, but this one stays with me. Keisha wasn't just another victim. She was a child who never got her chance to live. The defendant made sure of that. He looked at her and saw nothing but a thing to use and discard. That's not an accident. That's murder." The defense tried to fight back, bringing up Keisha's work on the streets. "She was there by choice," the attorney argued. "She knew the risks. My client didn't seek her out as a victim. He sought her out for business." A murmur of anger rippled through the courtroom at those words. The judge rapped her gavel sharply. "Control your emotions," she warned. But even she looked troubled by the attempt to tarnish the dead girl's name. In rebuttal, Prosecutor Carter rose, her voice shaking with controlled fury. "Choice? You dare call it a choice when an 18-year-old girl, abandoned by her parents and failed by every system meant to protect her, is forced onto the streets just to eat? That is not choice. That is survival." And Marcus Lane turned her survival into her execution. Jurors leaned forward, riveted. The tension in the room was palpable. Finally came the most haunting testimony, the homeless man, Luther, who had found Keisha's body. He walked slowly to the witness stand, his shoulders stooped, his eyes watery. "I've seen a lot in my life," he said softly, "but when I found her, it broke me. She looked so young. She looked like she was still asking for help, even after she was gone." His words drew tears from several people in the gallery, and even one juror brushed at her eyes. Through it all, Marcus remained unmoved. He watched, smirking occasionally, yawning at others, as though none of it touched him. To Harris, who sat nearby, that cold indifference was proof enough of his guilt. After 2 weeks of testimony, the closing arguments arrived. Carter stood tall, her voice ringing out. "This case comes down to one truth. Keisha mattered. Her life mattered. And if we allow Marcus Lane to walk free, we are telling every predator that young girls like her are worth nothing. I ask you, deliver justice, not just for Keisha, but for every child this city has failed." The defense tried once more to plead for mercy, for lesser charges. But their words felt hollow against the mountain of evidence. When the jury filed out to deliberate, the room exhaled. Hours ticked by. Harris sat with his hands clasped, whispering a silent prayer. The weight of the city seemed to hang on what 12 strangers would decide. At last, the jury returned. The foreman stood, holding the paper that would decide Marcus Lane's fate. The courtroom held its breath. The foreman of the jury unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The silence in the courtroom was so thick it felt alive. Every cough, every shuffle, every heartbeat drowned beneath the anticipation of the words about to be spoken. The judge's voice was calm, steady. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreman replied. He cleared his throat, then read aloud. "On the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Lane, guilty." The words struck the room like thunder. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Some wept openly, others whispered prayers. Detective Harris closed his eyes, letting out a long, heavy breath. He had fought too many battles where justice never came. This time it had. Marcus sat stone-faced, though a flicker of anger crossed his eyes. His smirk was gone, replaced by a clenched jaw as the judge turned to the jury again. "And what is your recommendation for sentencing?" The foreman's voice was firmer now, steady with conviction. "We recommend the death penalty." The gallery erupted, cries of relief, shouts of approval, sobs of grief. The judge banged her gavel sharply until order was restored. But nothing could silence the echo of those words. Death penalty. The city had demanded justice, and justice had come with finality. Judge Collins leaned forward, her voice grave. Marcus Lane, the jury has found you guilty of murder in the first degree, and they have recommended the ultimate sentence. I hereby sentence you to death, to be carried out by the state. May God have mercy on your soul. For a moment, Marcus stared at her, his eyes burning with defiance. Then, he leaned back in his chair and sneered. You think killing me will change anything? You think it'll stop what's out there? You're wrong. You can bury me, but you can't bury the streets. His words chilled the room, but the deputies were already moving in, pulling him to his feet and fastening shackles around his wrists. He struggled briefly, like a cornered animal, before the weight of iron forced him still. From the back of the courtroom, a woman's voice rang out, raw with grief. She was just a girl. She didn't deserve to die. Others joined in, voices rising, echoing against the wooden walls. Harris sat silently, watching Marcus being led away. He felt no triumph, no joy, only a weary sense of resolution. Justice had been done, yes. But justice did not bring Keisha back. It never did. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was buzzing with energy. Reporters shouted into microphones. Marcus Lane has been sentenced to death for the brutal murder of 18-year-old Keisha Williams. The jury deliberated only 4 hours before delivering the unanimous verdict. Candles flickered at the vigil down the street, where people embraced, some crying, some simply standing in silence. For the community, the sentence was a statement. Keisha's life mattered. For the system, it was a rare victory. But for Harris, it was something quieter, more personal. He thought of the photograph in his file, of a girl with weary eyes who still deserved a chance she never got. As the sun set that evening, Harris walked alone to the alley where Keisha had been found. The yellow tape was gone, but the memory remained sharp. Flowers still lay wilted by the wall, their colors fading but their meaning still strong. Harris lit a cigarette, staring at the spot where she had died. Justice came, kid, he murmured. It's not enough, but it's what I could give you. The smoke curled upward, vanishing into the night sky, as if carrying his words with it. Marcus Lane's fate was sealed. But the story of Keisha, the abandoned girl who had been silenced too soon, would not be forgotten. Her name had become a cry for justice, a reminder of the lives too often discarded, and a warning that behind every statistic was a face, a story, a soul. When the gavel struck for the final time and Marcus Lane was led away, it felt as though the city exhaled. For weeks afterward, newspapers splashed his face across their front pages, headlines declaring the victory of justice. Alley killer sentenced to death. Jury delivers swift verdict. Reporters analyzed every angle, from the courtroom drama to the broader meaning of the case. But for those who had known Keisha, justice was not a headline. It was a hollow echo. A sentence, no matter how final, did not erase the image of her lifeless body in that alley. It did not bring back her laughter, or the dreams she once scribbled in notebooks before the world convinced her they were worthless. Detective Harris carried her memory with him in the quiet moments. He thought of her when he saw young girls waiting at bus stops late at night, when he passed foster homes with cracked windows, when he caught sight of tired teenagers wandering the streets. Each one was a reminder of how fragile the line was between survival and tragedy. The city, too, wrestled with what her death meant. On one side, activists rallied, demanding reforms to protect vulnerable youth. They called for better shelters, more resources, stronger safety nets. On the other, critics dismissed it as wasted breath. You can't save everyone, they muttered. Some people are just destined for the streets. The debate grew heated, but beneath it all lay a truth too painful to ignore. Keisha had been failed long before Marcus Lane put his hands around her throat. At the alley where she was found, a memorial took root. First it was flowers and candles, then posters with her name written in bold black letters. Justice for Keisha. Children left stuffed animals. Mothers brought pictures of their own daughters. Strangers stood in silence, whispering prayers. Over time, the wall itself became a canvas, covered in painted wings, a halo, and the words, "She mattered." One evening, Harris returned there. The city was quieter now, the frenzy of the trial fading, but the memorial still stood strong. A grandmother knelt at the wall, straightening wilted flowers. Her granddaughter, no older than 10, placed a drawing on the ground. A house with a garden, crayon colors bright against the gray pavement. She said she wanted Keisha to have a home in heaven. The grandmother explained softly when she noticed Harris watching. His throat tightened. He remembered Keisha's case file, how she had bounced from home to home, never finding a place to belong. The drawing felt like a gift from one child to another, a small mercy in a world that had given Keisha so little. As Harris walked away, he realized the trial had not closed the book on Keisha's story. If anything, it had written her name more deeply into the city's conscience. She was no longer just a girl in an alley. She had become a question that lingered. How many more would it take before things changed? Marcus Lane would die by lethal injection one day, and perhaps some would call it closure. But Harris knew closure was a myth. What people needed was not simply the removal of a monster, but the recognition of the humanity of those he preyed upon. That night, as he sat on his porch with the city lights stretching in the distance, Harris whispered into the dark, "I kept my promise, kid. But we've got a long way to go." In the silence that followed, it felt as though Keisha's story still hung in the air, not just as a tragedy, but as a warning, a plea, and a legacy. She was gone, but she was not forgotten.